All right, well, if you have your Bibles with you today, we'll be in John chapter 12. John chapter 12, and while you are turning to that, I want you to know that today we're going to finish our series through John chapter 12, and we'll start a new one next week, and we're going to call it Real Love. And we're going to be going through 1 Corinthians chapter 13, a portion of it anyway, be a 3-week service, and we'll actually conclude that series with Thomas Osterkamp, who will be speaking at our married couples retreat. He will be concluding that series on March the 9th, so I'm really looking forward to that. But for today, we're going to be in John chapter 12. We're going to pick up in verse 44 here in just a second. But before I jump into that, I needed to tell you a story. I've had the opportunity to coach the basketball team at Christian Life Academy for the last 6 years or so, and I did really well in the first 5 years. But in the last 2 months, in 5 years, I never got one technical foul. In 2 months, actually in 2 weeks, I got 2. And I think I told you guys the story about those, and if I didn't, just suffice it to say I was right and they were wrong. Funny story on both of those. Honestly, I don't think I deserved either one of them. I was not being unkind. But anyway, that's a whole other story. Fast forward to last week. Last week we're playing a game, and my son, who is actually on one of the cameras here, he's a senior this year, and he was playing, and he was giving it his all. I tell people that he's our Dennis Rodman minus the tattoos and piercings. He's just all out while he's going out there, and he was running across half court, and I saw him like move funny as another guy was coming at him, and when he moved funny, he just collapsed to the ground, and he was writhing in pain, and I think the coach side of me kind of stepped out and the dad side of me stepped in, and the officials were not having that. They were letting the play continue on, and the other team ended up getting the ball, and they started to come back down, and the dad side of me was like, "Come on, man, call a timeout. He's hurting on the floor." And I said, "Timeout, timeout." The other team had the ball. If you don't know basketball, you're not allowed to do that. You can't call timeout unless you have the ball. And so I'm yelling, "Timeout, timeout." And the official coming down blows the whistle, and he goes, "You can't do that." And I said, "Fine, give me a technical." And I walked out on the floor. And I cared to my son, who, as you can see, is doing perfectly fine. And I'll not tell you what exactly happened. Ask him after the service. I'm sure he'll tell you. But anyway, all that to say, we had our senior night just a few days later, and someone overheard what I said to the official and had heard about the other 2 technical fouls, and he was so kind as to give me this pop figure of Mr. T, which I am now called by him and his family, Mr. T, not for the same reasons I pity the fool, all right? But when I wanted to reach my son who was hurting on the floor, I was essentially saying to the referee when I said, "Give me a technical, I don't care." I was essentially saying, "Let me make this clear. I'm going to go take care of my son, and you can do whatever you want." I don't know if you've ever been in that situation before, but you've probably been in a situation where you've uttered those words, "Let me make this clear," right? I can vividly remember my dad telling me, "Let me make this clear. You're going to do this with a whooping or without a whooping. Which would you like?" I can remember one time when AT&T, I had a service contract with them, and we moved, and they could no longer provide the service. And I called them to cancel it, and they said, "You can't cancel it." And I said, "I'm going to. Let me make this clear." They said, "Well, you can't do that." I said, "Well, let me make it very clear. You're not getting any more money out of me." And they got somebody on the line, and they said, "We're going to make a one-time exception." And I laughed, and I said, "I don't care. I'm not giving you any money if you cannot provide the service," right? Let me make this clear. When we come to the end of John chapter 12, these 7 verses are, in my Bible anyway, it says that it's Jesus' last public discourse. This is his last speech, or his last sermon, if you will, before he is going to go into a lot of private interactions with just his disciples in this last week leading up to his crucifixion. Jesus at this point had been in public ministry for about 3.5 years. And in these last 7 verses, in this final speech, what he's doing is he's summarizing his mission. He's essentially reviewing all of the things that he had been teaching over the last 3.5 years. And if I could put it into some simple verbiage that we would understand, I would say that Jesus is saying, "Let me make this clear." And the things that he makes clear to them are things that he also makes clear to us. in these last 7 verses. The first thing that Jesus makes very clear in these 7 verses in his last public discourse is this. He makes very clear the way of salvation. The way of salvation. The Bible talks about how Jesus went unto his own, right? And those would be the Israelites or the Jewish people. We know that according to the scriptures, the Jewish people were very religious people. They were church-going. Of course, they didn't have the church then. They had the temple, but they were temple-going people, right? They not only believed in God, but these Israelites knew that they needed to be redeemed. They knew that they needed to be saved. They knew that they had a problem. There was a thing of sin that had broken their fellowship with God, and they knew that they needed to be fixed, right? When you read the stories about the Jews, you see a way of life that not only includes time in prayer and Bible reading and time in the temple, but you constantly see them making these sacrifices. Why were the Israelites constantly making sacrifices? Whether they were sacrificing bulls or goats or oxen or lambs or whatever it was that they were sacrificing, why were they doing that? They were doing that because they knew that they had sinned against a holy God. And something needed to be done to atone for that sin, or for that sin to be paid for. And so they would sacrifice these animals. We see this understanding even in pagan cultures, cultures that know nothing of Jesus, cultures that know nothing of the God of the Bible. The book of Romans, we read in chapter 1 just a couple of weeks ago about how the earth itself, creation, teaches us that there is a creator. And this clear reality is seen even by pagans who also offer sacrifices to this unknown God. The difference between the Israelites was that they knew that their sacrifices were only temporary. The difference is they knew that their sacrifices that they were making, when they would sacrifice a lamb or a sheep or a dove, whenever they would make that sacrifice, they knew that that was just temporary, and that's why they did it over and over and over again, because they knew that eventually there was going to be a Messiah. They knew that eventually they were going to have a Redeemer that would be sent by God that would redeem their sins and forgive them and bring them back into relationship with God. And now Jesus, 3.5 years ago, has stepped onto the scene to these Israelite people, and he clearly tells them, that's me. He clearly has told them, I am that Messiah. I am the one that was sent by God. His last public message, he's essentially saying, let me make this clear. I want you to know the way of salvation is through me. Look what he said in verse number 44 in this summary of his mission. Jesus cried and said, he that believeth on me, believeth not on me, but on him that sent me. And he that seeth me, seeth him that sent me. Jesus is going to put it a different way in John 14, where he's going to say, I am the way. I am the truth, and I am the life, and no man comes unto the Father but by me, right? He's saying, hey, let me make this clear. And just as he wanted to make it clear for the Israelites in this last summary, right after they had rejected him, as we've been talking about here in John chapter 12, I think it's important that we make it clear even for us today. I want you to know there is a God. We have sinned against him, and according to this book, there is only one way to be forgiven, and that is to believe the claims of Jesus Christ. It's incredibly important that we say that, because we live in a day and age where people have your truth and my truth, but Jesus said he is the truth. And ultimately, our beliefs have to have some sort of foundation. And for me and for this church, we have decided that the Bible is our sole authority for all matters of faith and practice. And if this book is true, the only way the person can be redeemed is through Jesus Christ. There are a lot of people that say they believe in God. The truth is that the people in this story believed in God. Their ancestors, they grew up in church, right? They had been around it their entire lives. They all believed in God. If what Jesus said is true, then if your faith is not in Jesus, then you cannot be saved. If what Jesus says is true, if he is the way, if he is the truth, if he was sent by God to be our Messiah, then if my faith is not in him alone, then I cannot be a Christian. I am not a Christian. It troubles me when I have an opportunity to talk to people about their faith. And I'll say, tell me about when you became a Christian. And often whenever I ask people about that, one of the things I hear a lot of times is, well, I've always been a Christian. Or they'll say things like, well, I'm a man of faith. Or they'll say, I believe in God. Or they'll tell me a story about, the day they found God. They had been drinking, or they had been tore up on drugs, or they were going through a divorce. And man, I came to the end of it, and I was just like, man, I'm going to trust you, God, and I believe in you now. And I turned my life around. There are glaring red flags to every one of those details. And the glaring red flag is that there is no mention of Jesus. There is no mention of believing that Jesus is the Messiah, that he died on the cross, that he was buried and rose again. It is troubling to me when I hear a testimony like that. It is troubling to me when I hear these television preachers. You hear these radio preachers that they'll talk about, here's 7 steps to a good marriage, and here's how to, be kind and get people to like you. And then at the end of the message, they'll say, now, if you want to go to heaven, then just repeat something like this after me. God, I know you love me. Even though I'm a sinner, please save me and help me live for you. Please come into my heart and save me. Let me tell you, if that is your testimony, you have not believed the gospel. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes into the Father but through him. Let me make this clear. Jesus is the way of salvation. The reason he came to earth was to redeem his people. He was sent by God, as verse number 44 says. He lived the life that we could not live. He was sinless. And then he took his sinless body, his sinless life, and died in our place on the cross. And then he overcame death by the resurrection. I want you to know that there are not, if this book is true, maybe we could have titled the sermon that, if this book is true. If this book is true, there are not many ways to heaven. If this book is true, there is one way to heaven. If you're like the Israelites and you know that there's a God and you know that you have sinned against him, the only way to be forgiven is to believe Jesus. One of the questions I like to ask people is, if you were to stand before God, after you died, you stood before God, and he said, why should I let you into heaven? What would you tell him? So many people start a laundry list of all the good things they've done, or comparing themselves to the people that have done things worse than them. But the only acceptable answer is, I have believed the gospel of Jesus Christ. I hope that you can remember a time that you've done that. To believe this means to believe that Jesus was more than just a good man. He didn't come just to point us to God. He came as God to die for man, to believe that he gave his life for us and that he rose from the dead. Salvation does not come in any other way. The main way that people believe that it comes is through works. That's what they were believing here in these Old Testament Israelites were believing, that it was coming through their good works. But Paul made this very clear for us in the book of Ephesians chapter 2. He said this, for by grace are you saved, through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. We are not forgiven because we do good things. Because, man, could you imagine if we got to heaven and the reason we made it in is because we were good? How many of you guys know someone in your life as kind of that is the word braggart still a word that people use, a braggart? How many of you guys know a braggart? Pompous. Come on now. Point at them if they're here, all right? Somebody that just always one-ups oh, that's nothing. Let me tell you about this one time. And you're like, I wish you'd shut up. And hey, I'm thankful that we're not saved by works, because you'd have to put up with that junk all up in heaven if we were saved by our good works. That's what it says, right? Because if we were saved by works, then we'd be boasting up there. Let me tell you why I deserve to be in heaven. Let me tell you about the crazy in-laws I had to put up with, or let me tell you about this guy I had to work with, or let me tell you about everything that I had to go through. And there's none of that in heaven, because we're not saved by works. We are saved by God's grace through faith in Jesus Christ. Probably the most popular verse in Scripture is so important to be reminded of. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Look, can this be any more clear? I don't think we could say it any more plainly. The question before us is, have you believed this? Have you put your faith in the gospel of Christ? If not, there's a second thing that Jesus makes clear in his final public message, and that is this: not only the way of salvation, but the reality of judgment. The reality of judgment. We live in a society that is more concerned with whether or not a person's feelings are hurt than they are with truth. We live in a society where we feel like we'll hurt someone's feelings, so you can't say abortion is wrong. You'll hurt someone's feelings, so you can't say there's only two genders or homosexuality is a sin. Like, you can't say those things because you'll hurt people's feelings. Now, let me step back from that for a second, because a lot of times when you start to talk about these hot-button issues amongst some believers, we almost get really fired up. We get more fired up about those things than we do about the gospel, which is a red flag. That's kind of a problem, all right? We need to focus on the gospel. But we get so fired up about that we feel like we have to speak truth to try to evoke some kind of emotion out of others. But Jesus actually tells us through Apostle Paul that whenever we speak the truth, we're not looking to evoke emotion, we're looking to show empathy. The Bible tells us to speak the truth in love, right? Showing empathy towards others. So it is important that we recognize that, yes, we do need to speak the truth, but the truth needs to be spoken in love. There's a long list of things that we could get fired up about, but Jesus' final public message focused in on this simple truth that is not politically correct, and that is that there will be judgment one day. Matter of fact, look what he said in verse number 47. He said, "And if any man hear my words and believe not, I judge him not. For I came not to judge the world, but to save the world." And when you read that verse, you might go, wait a second. You just said that there's going to be judgment, but Jesus says right here that he's not going to judge. And what a lot of people like to do is they like to lift verses out of Scripture. And this would be a verse that some people would point to and say, see, Jesus didn't talk about wanting to judge others. That's what Jesus does. Hold on. All right, look what he said in the very next verse. Verse number 48 says, "He that rejecteth me and receiveth not my words hath one that judgeth him. The word that I have spoken, the same shall judge him in the last day." This word that he has spoken is that he is the Messiah. This word that has been delivered to us is that as our Messiah, he would give his life on the cross and would rise from the dead. And he says if we reject that, if we don't believe that, if we run from that, then we will be judged by that on that final judgment day. Anyone that rejects Jesus will be condemned. Jesus' words determine our eternal destiny. This passage is a clear call for us to think about the last day. We get so wrapped up in this day that we forget about the last day. I was talking after our worship practice this morning. John was talking about a coworker of his that just passed away. Just 3.5 months ago was diagnosed with cancer as a 36-year-old man with 3 children under 10 years old. They had the funeral yesterday. And John shared a little bit about that. I want to ask you to pray for his wife and children. But there's something about funerals. There's something about the loss of life that forces us to think about our last day, that forces us to think about eternity. As a matter of fact, it was Solomon, the wisest man outside of Jesus to ever walk the face of the earth, in Ecclesiastes said that it's actually better to go to the house of mourning, a funeral, than to go to the house of feasting, a party. And the reason he said it's better to go to a funeral than a party is because the living will lay it to their heart. It forces us to think about our last day. And that's what Jesus is summarizing. He's saying, look, the reason I came was to deal with your last day so that you will be ready for that judgment day. Because all of us are living souls that will live eternally in one of two places. Hebrews 9 tells us that it is appointed unto men once to die, and after this, the judgment. Jesus concludes his final public message by pointing out that this message that he's delivering is from God the Father. Look what he said in verse 49. "For I have not spoken of myself, but the Father which sent me, he gave me commandment what I should say and what I should speak. And I know that his commandment is life everlasting. Whatsoever I speak, therefore, even as the Father said unto me, so I speak. When he says that this commandment is life everlasting, it's important that we hone in on that, because this message that he is sharing of judgment is really a message of hope. It's a message of, yes, one of these days we will stand before God and we will be guilty unless we believe the message of Jesus. And if we believe the message of Jesus, then that brings life everlasting. As Jesus said, his goal was not to come and to judge us, but rather to redeem us. His goal was not to condemn us, but to save us. We know John 3:16, but oftentimes we forget the next couple of verses. John 3:16 said that whoever believes shall have eternal life, right? But look what he said in verse 17. He said, for God sent not Jesus into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. And then in the last verse, verse 18, he says, if he that believeth on him is not condemned, but he that believeth not is condemned already, because he hath not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. Just as he was telling them in this final public message, he was telling them, today I'm here to save, but one day that's going to change. He came the first time as a lamb, and he'll come the second time as a lion. And just as he told them, he's telling us today that if we find ourselves in that position where we're experiencing what I experienced as a young child, the conviction of sin and awareness of a sin against a holy God, then the good news is that God did not come to leave you there and just point that out. He came to rescue from there and to save us. And the question before us today is, where are you? Are you experiencing condemnation because you've not yet believed? Or have you believed the gospel? The last thing that is made clear in this passage is that there is a need for change. There's a need for change. This final public message is a call to action. It's a call to believe something. It's a call to make a decision. Oftentimes, when I go up the stairs, there's a tool closet just right up the stairs over here to go up to some of the life group and children's ministry areas. And my wife and the staff members here at the church like to call me a light Nazi. Is anyone else a light Nazi? Like always going around and turning off the lights? And I told my wife, hey, when we get solar, you can leave every light in the house on. But that was not true. I still like to turn off all the lights and conserve that free energy that we're getting from solar panels and things like that, right? And so how many of you live with a light Nazi, just out of curiosity? All right, yeah, that's good. That's me. And so one day, I don't know, a couple of years ago, Mark went upstairs, and he has tried to leave the lights off because he knows I'm a light Nazi and he doesn't want to get fired. And so that tool closet up there, I had went into it, and I did not shut the door, which I normally do, but for whatever reason, I left the door propped open like a foot, maybe a foot and a half. And Mark went up there, and the lights were off, and you know where this is going. He went up the stairs, and he turned right into the door and caught the edge of the door. I think you still got a scar on your forehead, don't you? Yeah, he's got a scar. He'll show it to you afterwards. You can take a picture of it if you want to. He's got a scar right there from having the light off. How many of you guys have experienced something like, how many of you guys have ever, the last time you cussed was when you stubbed your toe because you left the light off, right? I mean, there's something about walking in darkness that you find yourselves having something like this happen. When the light is on, it's really hard to stub your toe, unless you're walking with your phone, right? When the light is on, it's hard to run into a door. And what he told us, one verse we skipped over here is verse number 46. In this final summary, Jesus reminds of one of the I am statements. In verse number 46, he says, I am come a light into the world, that whosoever believeth on me should not abide in darkness. It was the story of the woman taken in adultery. You remember that, when all the accusers were around him? It was right after that woman that was caught in the act of adultery that Jesus made this I am statement the first time in John chapter 8, I think. He said, I am the light of the world. And he reminds them of this here in this passage. He calls himself the light. He says, the light has been turned on. Men have been living in darkness up to this point. We can now clearly see what we were not able to see before. For them, they were looking for the Messiah. They were in darkness, waiting and wondering. And then finally, Jesus comes in. He is the light. We can clearly see that he is the Messiah. And the question before us is, we can walk in the light or we can walk away from the light. We can walk in the light, or we can walk or abide in darkness. The Israelites tried to put out the light, right? This is the last time that he gives this public address, and just a week later, they are literally going to call for his death. But what about us? Have we seen the light of the need for salvation? Are we delaying that, saying, oh, I'll deal with that later? Are we denying it and saying, no, I don't, that's not for me? Or maybe we're just running from it. Is Jesus pursuing you like he was pursuing the Israelites? Is he running after you? Is he warning you? I think the majority of us that are here today would say that we've believed the gospel. We have believed in the light of Jesus. The question for us is, are we walking in that light? Or are we abiding in darkness? I mean, read the verse again. He says, I'm coming to the world that whosoever believeth on me. How many guys would say you've believed on Christ, right? Most of us would say, I've believed on Christ. So he's talking about us. If we have believed on him, we shouldn't abide in darkness. We should turn from the sin that nailed Jesus to the cross, right? And so this can be a really relative term. What does it look like to walk in darkness? And we could all give different examples of what it looks like. But it's actually very clear for us in Galatians chapter 5, where he talks about the works of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit. How do we know if we're walking in the light? If we're walking in the light, the Spirit of God is producing love in our lives. If we're walking in the light, the Spirit of God is producing joy. The Spirit of God is producing peace and patience. The Spirit of God is producing goodness and faith and gentleness and self-control. Would the people around us say that those are adjectives that describe our lives? If not, there's a good chance that we're not walking in the light. We're actually abiding in darkness. And earlier in that chapter of Galatians 5, when he talks about the works of the flesh, he said, here's what it looks like to walk in darkness. Sexually immoral. We have idols. We experience hatred. There's anger or discord. We have fits of rage. We're jealous. We're selfish. There are dissensions and envy and drunkenness. The Bible tells us that faith in Jesus leads us out of this darkness. Light and darkness cannot peacefully coexist. And that's why for some of us, there's an absence of peace in our lives, even though we believe the gospel. There's an absence of peace in our homes. There's an absence of love. There's an absence of the fruit of the Spirit in our lives. And oftentimes it's because, yes, we've believed him, but we're still walking in darkness. I'll conclude just by sharing a story with you. And I honestly can't remember which one of my daughters it was. It was either Emma or Gracie. And they were very young. They were still in a crib. And one of the things that you may or may not know about my wife is my wife does a lot of amazing things. I am the most blessed man alive, and I'm very thankful for her, except for one thing. She cannot handle puke. She can handle all the other accidents. She can handle all the other stuff, but whether it's a human or an animal, puke is off of her bingo card, all right? She does not clean up puke. And in the middle of the night, when you hear something puking, it will wake you up right away. You know what I'm talking about? Our bedroom was just down the hallway, and I believe it was Emma, because she was still young at the time, and we heard that noise, and I looked at her, and she's like, so that meant that I was the one that had to do it. And so I got up, and I went in the room, and she was sitting up in her crib and just puke all over. And I turned on a small light, and I said, you are such a loser. What are you puking all over yourself? Smell yourself. Seriously, your mom doesn't even want to touch you right now. You're lucky you have me in your life. You think I said any of those things? As a matter of fact, I felt such emotion. At that time in my life, I was not really a kind of guy that talked much about my emotions, but I felt such emotion. I felt such empathy for her in that moment because she was scared. She was hurting. She needed help. And I did not step into her room to condemn her. I stepped in to help her. And that is the final summary of the mission of Jesus. Is if you're sitting here today and you're like, well, that sure sounded like that old school hellfire and brimstone stuff. You know what? We need to hear that because that is the truth. But the good news is that that stuff is not shared so that God just make you walk out of here with your head hung low and feeling sorry for yourself. You ought to walk out of here feeling like he came and loved me just as I am, decided to clean me up, and that's the kind of God that I serve. He was not there to judge us. He is there to clean us up, to soothe, to help, to rescue us. If Jesus is the light of the world, and he's shining this truth into your life, I want to invite you to believe him today. When someone says, let me make this clear, there's not a whole lot you can do to fight back against it, right? Their minds are made up. The truth has been shared. Here's a little word of advice. If a police officer ever tells you, let me make this clear, then I would probably listen really close to whatever he's about to say, right? As Jesus is concluding the message, he says, let me make this clear. We have a choice to believe it or reject it. What would it look like for you to walk in the light? Maybe it's believing the gospel. Maybe you've never done that before. Maybe it was unclear, and today it's been made clear. Maybe it is believing the gospel. But maybe for many others, maybe it's not for salvation, but it's for sanctification. It's to get out of the darkness and the problems and the pain that it's bringing into our lives and start to walk in the light and let Jesus begin to produce the fruit that he desires in our lives.